I think we are all aware that there is some relief to know that there is a ceasefire and the suffering of the people of Gaza, at least from direct killing and bombing and genocide policies, at least for now, has stopped. But I think we all understand that the condition in the Gaza Strip, the health condition, the food conditions are such that unfortunately, without proper humanitarian and international aid, the suffering of the people will continue, and with it also the number of the people who might die or not be able to have a normal life. So, with all the joy of hearing about the ceasefire, we should understand that the basic Israeli policy has not changed towards the Gaza Strip. And although they did not succeed in defeating uh, totally the Hamas, they are still controlling the life of almost 2 million people. And their plans for the life of these 2 million people is not boding well, given what we know about their intentions and strategies. So, whatever our activism was, and how energetic it was in order to try and persuade our governments to pressure Israel to stop the fighting, to accept a ceasefire, we should continue, of course, the same efforts. So I think it's important to understand that the same pressure, the same energy is still needed because despite of the ceasefire, we are still facing a genocidal policy. And as you probably know, many of you know, this is now not limited to the Gaza Strip. It has been extended to the West Bank with a particular focus on the city of Jenin and the Jenin refugee camps. So the same genocidal policy that was implemented towards the Gaza Strip is now being expanded and imposed on Jenin and the Jenin refugee camp, but also on some other parts nearby in the cities of Tubas, Tulkarem, and Nablus. I think that what we probably all know is what we have to do to try and change the position of the international community and our own countries in order to make sure that the ceasefire persists and that there's really a proper end for the war. But there is a difference between planning for the next year, which is very important given the fact that the Israeli plans have the potential of causing more carnage, more death, and more suffering. But there's a difference between planning for that year, the next year, and taking a more strategic, long term view. And sometimes it's very difficult to adopt a strategic thinking when you feel the urgency, and rightly so, to act for what is happening today or tomorrow. So you don't want to think about the more distant future. But I think we have no choice because with all our energy, with all our conviction, with all our allies, and with everything that we are trying to do and the Palestinians are trying to do, it is unfortunately quite likely that nobody would able to stop Israel in the next year or two, which is very bad news. And I hope I'm wrong, but I'm not talking here as an activist. I'm talking here as an analyst, knowing the Israeli intentions, knowing the Israeli strategy, and understanding the balance of power on the ground, in the region, and in the international community. But if we look at the long run, then we can see huge potential for change. If you want an optimistic potential for change. But for that, especially from our perspective in Europe, we have to go back and ask ourselves, how is it possible that Europe, and in particular Western Europe, could have adopted such an indifferent position, such an, I would say, inhuman position towards the genocide in Gaza? I'm not talking about the societies, I'm talking about the governments, the mainstream media, and in some cases, the mainstream academia. Because everything that happened in the last year and a half, at least for people who are following closely the situation in Israel and Palestine, was unfortunately not that surprising. There was not that much of surprise to the ferocity of the Hamas attack on the 7th of October. And unfortunately, many of us predicted that Israel would react the way it reacted, using such an attack like the one in the 7th of October as a pretext, as an excuse to implement its ideological strategic wish to get as much of Palestine as possible and get rid of as many Palestinians as possible. So these two developments, at least to those of us who are very much involved in this situation, was not very surprising. What really surprised us, I think, at least I'm talking about myself, but I know this position is shared by many of my friends, is the European and especially the Western European position. This is a time where you can watch a genocide daily on your screen. When the reports from international organizations, humanitarian organizations, including organizations that are based in Geneva, are so clear, are so not ambiguous about the genocide that is unfolding in Gaza. And yet, the reaction of the governments of West Europe was very weak, very much in line of what the Israeli governments want them to do in such a situation. And it seemed like a total, it's a kind of a unified position across the continent by political elites, a unified position that was translated into a total indifference to the suffering of the Palestinians, and by that, providing immunity to Israel to continue its actions. And I think for activists, whether we are in Switzerland, whether we are in the UK, or any part of Europe, and in particular Western Europe, but also in Central and Eastern Europe, we should ask ourselves, how is it possible that such a policy of indifference towards a televised genocide can happen? But there is even more absurd layer to the official Western position towards the genocide in Gaza. How is it possible that Western governments, Western police forces, Western security services in West Europe, including in Switzerland, are treating genuine solidarity by members of their society with the suffering of the victims of genocide? The genuine solidarity is treated as acts of terror or acts that equivalent to anti-Semitism. How did we reach such an absurd, incomprehensible position of phase in which the most hopeful slogan that people are chanting, the hopeful slogan that people who live between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean would be free, regardless of who they are? How come such a slogan that wants people to be free in their own homeland is forbidden in so many countries in Europe and is regarded as support for terrorism and an act of anti-Semitism. And in some places, it is even equated with Holocaust denial. This is unbelievable if you think about it, and yet this is the reality we live in. And I think it's important to analyze why is this the European position, and through that analysis, hopefully, to define more clearly what the solidarity movement with the Palestinians should do towards the unacceptable, immoral, illogical positions of their governments and their security services in the service of Israel. One explanation, I think, which is important, is the essence of politics today, or the way that politics is done today, or the level of the political elites, including in Switzerland. We are in an age, and of course there are exceptions, but we are in an age in West Europe and Central Europe where politicians are rarely concerned genuinely with moral issues or issues of justice. They see electorates not as a group of people that they have to deal with their concerns, but rather they see the electorate as the power base that would re-elect them in the next elections. So their lack of interest in the suffering of the Palestinian is just one item of very important issues that they ignore, which are highly important, in fact, are existential for their own societies, whether it's global warming, poverty, life-seeking people who come to Europe, and so on. The attitude towards Palestine reflects this lack of genuine interest in humanity, in human beings, and in the real concerns of societies by the political elites of Western Europe. And therefore, we cannot expect this generation of politicians, unfortunately, to adopt a moral and just position towards Israel and its policies. I would have liked to believe that one state, at least in Europe, would follow the Colombian example and cede diplomatic relations with Israel, but I'm not very hopeful about it in the very near future. But I think there's another explanation for this, and again, I'm really genuinely say it, this unbelievable European, Western European, Central European indifference towards the genocide of the Palestinians. And that explanation has a lot to do with history. Usually, I don't think audiences or activists or people in general need historians. You can dispense with historians most of the time and have a very good life. But in this case, I think historians can be important because the European position has to be contextualized within the history of the relationship between Europe, Zionism, and Palestine. Zionism was a European solution to a European problem at the expense of the Palestinians. Europe had a genuine problem, and that was its racism towards its Jewish citizens. Because of all kinds of ideologies that wanted to create a pure Europe, a white Europe, a racist Europe, the easy victim in order to allow for that identity to emerge were the Jews. Very much as today, the victims for such a dream of a white Europe are the Arabs and Muslims who live in Europe. But in the case of the Jews, this racism went even further with the genocide of the Jews during the Second World War. And that was a wake-up call for Europe, no doubt. Europe, after the Second World War, wanted to create a world in which the mistakes that were done by Europeans would not be repeated. And they created a set of rules for themselves and the world at large, called the international law, the Declaration of Human Rights. All of that was meant to supposedly be lessons learned not only from the Holocaust, but from the horrible carnage that so many millions of people suffered from during the Second World War. And what was so interesting was that if you take this set of rules that were enshrined in international law, in the Human Rights Declaration, in all the attempts to build a new world through the United Nations later on, it is clear that from the principles of this new world, the best way of dealing with the past problem of racism towards Jews that led to genocide of the Jews was to make sure the Jews would feel safe in Europe, that Europe would be a place where racism against people because of their religion, because of their nationality, because of their gender, because of their identity, would not be anymore an acceptable political or cultural phenomenon. But instead of that, the Western governments, or the European Western governments, decided to adopt a different idea, not how to reintegrate the Jews into Europe, but rather they were willing to adopt a plan that was suggested to them by Christian Zionists, evangelical Christians, together with Jewish intellectuals and activists from Eastern Europe, who suggested that the best solution for the problem of Jews in Europe was to build a European state for the Jews, but not in Europe, in the Arab world, in the middle of the Arab world, through the colonization of Palestine. And these politicians who were very keen to support this idea that this is the best lesson to be learned from the Holocaust fully understood that in order to build a European state for the Jews, but not in Europe, in a place like Palestine, could mean only one thing: the dispossession of the Palestinians. So there was a complicity by the European political elite, the cultural elite, the economic elite, with this incredible solution that, if you think about it objectively, is totally illogical, totally impractical, totally immoral, that in order not to go again into a period of that could lead to another genocide of the Jews, you need to create a Jewish state at the heart of the Arab world, in the heart of the Muslim world. It was very clear from the very beginning that the only way that you can implement such a solution was through power. You can only enforce such a solution on the indigenous native people of Palestine, not only for establishing the state, but also for maintaining it, also for sustaining it. And that is what we are seeing here today, because the people themselves in Palestine were not sharing this enthusiasm that the best solution for racism against Jews in Europe was to create a racist Jew state in Palestine. They are fighting against it. They resist it, and they will continue to resist it. And that resistance leads to counter-resistance by the state, and the tragic results of this kind of reality that Europe created. We can see it today. So I think we have to understand that the indifference is connected to the knowledge of the complicity of Europe in the past and Europe in the present in imposing a European solution on the people of Palestine, in fact, on the Arab world as a whole. I think there is another layer that is also very important, and I'm sure you all are aware of what happened to our dear friend Ali Abu Nima in Zurich a few days ago. There is another layer that explains not only the indifference towards the suffering of the Palestinians, but the decision, which I referred to in the beginning of my talk, not to allow Europeans to show solidarity with the Palestinians. And that is something we have seen after 9/11. In every democratic European state, there are non-democratic elements, especially in the elite. People who don't like the freedoms that democracy gives to people. People who don't tolerate pluralism of ideas. People who would like the state to be far more in control, in the power to regulate people's ideas, people's vision, whether for economic reasons, whether for ideological reasons. This is for another lecture. It doesn't matter. But it's very clear that a political elite with the secret services in every country in Western Europe are collaborating with the idea that actually the support for Palestine is a good excuse to limit the basic human rights and civil rights of the Europeans themselves, so that the state is again in control. Maybe it was too, maybe the societies were too free, were too democratic, too pluralistic. So they are using, as they did after 9/11, the support, the genuine support, the massive popular support for Palestine as something that can be conveyed as a threat to the security of the state. And therefore, they are using that in order to silence people, firstly, on Palestine, but it will not stop there, because we can see exactly which political forces are enthusiastic about this idea that you can arrest young people for demonstrating for democracy and liberation in Palestine, who are supporting universities who fire faculty members who dare to show solidarity with the suffering of the Palestinians, and so on. So I think what we have here is a clear challenge to us, but one that we can deal with. I don't think our solidarity movement in Switzerland can do much more than it does to stop the genocide today in Gaza. Unfortunately, I wish I could tell you, oh, you've forgotten to do A, B, C, and if you would have done it, the genocide would have stopped, or the next steps would be stopped. No, unfortunately, you are powerless in that respect of doing more than you do. And what you do is excellent and is important. But there's much you can do in Europe, because it's very important to teach the Europeans, to challenge the European political elite, economic elite, intellectual elite, and to explain the complicity in creating this European state that has colonized Palestine, has constantly ethnically cleansing the Palestinians and now genociding them. This is not a problem outside of Europe. It's a European problem. It's a European issue. And I think so many people in the civil society understand it, but we are not getting to the political elite, we're not getting to the mainstream media, and we are facing a very strong establishment that even uses police and security service in order for that basic truth not to be debated, not to be exposed, not to learn something from it, not only with regard to our policies towards Palestine, but about the essence of our politics and the essence of our liberties in the 21st century. But we should really try and work a strategic plan for working on what we can work in Europe. We cannot replace the Palestinian movement in deciding what is the best solution for liberation. they will decide how they want to see a liberated Palestine, how they want to see a decolonized Palestine. But we can help in going to the source of the colonization, which is Europe, in order to help with the process of decolonization. Decolonization in Palestine will happen anyway because of the internal problems of Israel. But if there is no plan for the day after decolonization, decolonization can be a very long process of violence that we don't want to see. And I think the more we are able to persuade the international community in general, and Europe in particular, to take positions similar to the one taken by the Colombian government, then we are offering a non-violent strategy that can have huge impact on the reality on the ground and which also can rectify the past evils that are associated with the European support for the foundation of the Jewish state and sustaining its brutal policies today. It's one hopeful, I hope, vision I have that instead of seeing in Switzerland in every corner a Ukrainian flag, I will see a Palestinian flag. Because that would mean, and I'm not talking about on private houses. I know that many of you are putting them in private houses. I'm talking about official buildings. This is a sense that Europe begins to have its priorities right, understand its historical role and its historical position. I will end with one initiative that can give us a taste of where can we go with this, because Gary asked me also to talk about this. I don't know how many of you are familiar with something which is called the Oslo Initiative or the Oslo Conversation, which is led by the relentless friend of ours, the physician Mads Gilbert. As you know, for us, either as Palestinians or people who are in solidarity with the Palestinians, Oslo is associated with the worst kind of European involvement. And Norway presents itself as a mediator, is not an honest mediator, and it uses mediation in order to persuade the Palestinians to continue to live under occupation and oppression. Now, the initiative from Oslo is to say to first to Norway, but then to Europe as a whole, you are not asked by anyone to be a mediator. You are not a mediator between Arabs and Jews. Your role is to stand by the Palestinians because you have historical responsibility for that. So the idea is to try and convince, first of all, the Norwegian government, not to say we are trying to help the peace negotiations, but we are trying to help the Palestinians to liberate themselves and to free themselves from oppression, ethnic cleansing, and genocide. And let us hope that more and more Europeans, not just citizens, but institutions, governments, and elites would follow this example. And then Europe can play a very constructive role, not only in ending the suffering of the Palestinians, but contributing to building a free, a democratic Palestine from the river to the sea, which will allow all the refugees they want to come back to return, and would be a win-win for both Jews and Arabs who now live in that country. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ilan. You hear me? Yeah. Thank you so much for your very heartful words and analysis what you have made and what will happen. I think it's important to understand this also in Switzerland. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We have now, I think, a lot of questions, but we have also in the next minutes Mahmoud waiting. I think in 10 minutes he will be ready for us. Do you see the questions that have been made in the chat?
Just a second. Just a second.
So we will be happy if you can give short responses, and then
Okay.
10 minutes, 15 minutes, we have your colleague. It's okay?
Yeah, of course, but I can see the chat, but I can't see any question on the chat. Maybe it's on another thing. On the chat, there are no questions.
Ron.
Is there any other place where they can't be? They can be? Can't see them on the chats, I must say. Wait a minute, what else? No?
Okay,
It's not here.
so I see that it didn't work, that there was no questions, but perhaps I can ask the audience if somebody has a question.
Yeah, good afternoon. I would like to ask you, how do you think that the decolonization will take place? You said yes, for sure it will. So how?
Yes, thank you. That's a very important question. There are two ways it can happen. One is, even if without the success of the Palestinian movement to change the balance of power, without its success to create a united leadership, which it doesn't have today, and a clear vision for the future, which it doesn't have today, the decolonization is because of the internal development inside Israel. There is a kind of a civil war inside Israel. There is an economic crisis. Israel is losing the support of the Jewish people around the world, losing the support of civil societies around the world. Countries in the global south begin to think seriously about sanctions. And all this is leading, and has already started, to a process which will take time. I'm not saying that this will happen tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, of the disintegration of Israel. And in fact, in the Mashrek, in the Eastern Mediterranean, most of the states that were created, including Israel, after the First World War, are not holding up very, very well. Look at Syria, look at Lebanon, look at Iraq, and I don't think Jordan is that much behind, although it looks a bit more stable right now. So I think that that's one version of decolonization which I'm afraid of, because if there is no strong Palestinian national movement to fill the void that this will create, then this can go for a very long time. The more hopeful decolonization is, and this can happen because there's a very a new generation of Palestinians that might take the lead and will be more united, more organized, with a very clear vision. And I think it's developing as we speak. And that means that the Palestinian liberation movement is leading the decolonization, very much like the ANC led to the fall of the apartheid, and the FLN led the decolonization in Algeria. And that is one that when you are beginning to dismantle the colonialist institution, you are also offering alternative institution instead of them. And this is the one that is not yet happening, but can happen. But the first version of decolonization, by which I mean that Israel as a project, Zionism as a project, does not succeed in holding on. It is not. It's crumbling from within. It's imploding from within. It's a long process. I am confident as an analyst that it will happen. I don't know when it will happen, but I'm sure it will happen. So that's what I meant by decolonization. The fact that this whole project of imposing by force a Jewish state on an Arab country in the middle of the Arab world needs so much force that we've already seen in the last year and a half the limits of that force. And despite all kinds of things that are happening now that are slowing the decolonization, the populist politicians that are winning in America and in Europe, the war in the Ukraine, the nature of the Arab regimes, despite all of it, we can see that this process is still going on. I can see a question now.
Yes, there's a question. 1 second.
I think, yeah, there is a question. I have a question, Mr. Pappe. There is an organization called APA. In my
Yeah.
opinion, it influences the American government too much. How would you reduce the power and influence of APA? Well, I myself cannot reduce personally, but I think that it's important to understand the limits of APA. APAC is based on the support of two communities in America. One is the Christian Zionists, and the other is the Jewish community. The younger generation of Jews in America are not supporting APAC anymore in large number as they did in the past. And that weakens APAC. Of course, it still has the support of the Christian Zionists. But there is a very important problem here that would affect, in my mind, the power of APAC in the future. APAC is now connected to elements which are openly anti-Semitic, who hate Jews as much as they like Israel. And I think this would really limit the impact of APAC. It will only be a very powerful organization when a certain American political elite is in power. That political elite is in power now. I don't deny it. But I don't accept that it will always be in power. So I think APAC, like so many pro-Zionist lobbies, also outside the United States, depend on politics to continue as they are today. Immoral, populist, right-wing, neo-fascist elements are dominating political systems. This is or cynical kind of cynicism as the major virtue of politics. As long as this continues, then AIPAC and Israel are winning. The moment politics becomes more moral, deals more with justice, becomes more pluralistic, then it's going to help the decolonization and freedom of Palestine.
Thank you so much, Ilan. We are waiting until to Mahmoud. I have now a question from a woman in the public. 1 second.
Yes.
Hi, Professor Pappe. Thank you for your brilliant analysis and for your decade-long commitment to the cause. So I believe that both you and Mahmoud Ad, who will be joining us later, were born in Haifa, right? So my question is...
That's right.
Yeah. My question is, you were both born in Haifa, yet your legal and social statuses were quite different. As an Israeli historian, how do you see your role in challenging the Israeli society's reluctance to acknowledge these differences?
Yeah, definitely. I don't think I am considered any more legal in the eyes of the Israelis, but that's another story. But I understand your question. I think that the only way for an Israeli Jews to be part of the future is to be anti-Zionist, to totally reject the Zionist ideology. That is the reason for the different status that Mahmoud and I have in Haifa. And it's only with the dismantling of this ideology and the institution that represent this ideology that I think we can reintroduce into the country that is called Palestine the element of equality, as well as the element of restorative justice that will amend the injustices that had been done to people who were expelled, that their villages were destroyed, their property were taken. There is a whole mechanism that is called restorative justice that can be implemented as part of decolonization so that these injustices would be amended in the future. So the only way to change it is to do two things. One is to create a free Palestine. We cannot talk about the two-state solution anymore because this perpetuates the injustice that you are talking about. So we have to talk, I think, about the one-state solution as the only viable solution. And I think we should start talking now about how this new state would look like, because there's still 8 million Jews living in historical Palestine. And it's important also to talk about their future, not just the future of the Palestinians, but based on this idea of restorative justice and respecting all the rights that the Palestinians were denied in the last more than 100 years, one should actually say. So I see my role very much in trying to bring this about. I'm not alone, but we have to realize that inside the Israeli Jewish society, unfortunately, there are very few people who share this position. The good news is that I think a lot of Jews around the world are sharing this idea and moral position.
Hello. I have a
Hello.
question from the audience.
Yes.
A lady would like to know what role is played by the military elite or the military establishment in Israel, the US, and the NATO in the actual situation.
Yeah. Well, I think, first of all, the Israeli military elite is part and parcel of the genocide. And this elite, by the way, has changed in the last 20 years. More and more people who originally come from the Jewish settlements in the West Bank are now occupying very important position in this elite, which is one of the explanations for the particular inhumanity and brutality that the Israeli army is displaying, both in Gaza and in the West Bank. I think it's very important to understand that according to the International Court of Justice and according to the International Criminal Court, some of these Israeli generals and officers are now in danger, at least theoretically, of being arrested in certain countries because of the ruling of both the ICJ and the ICC. But they are very highly respected by the military elites of Europe, by the military elite of the United States, and by the military elite of NATO, which shows us that, as always is the case with Gaza and Palestine, the problem is beyond Gaza and Palestine. The problem is that international law does not apply to military elites in the West. It applies to military elite in Russia, but not, or Iran, or North Korea, but not to anyone that the West is part of the West or is an ally of the West. And that has to change. Otherwise, there's no point of calling it international law or universal law. And we have to make sure that we respect once more, because many of us in the global South do not respect anymore and do not trust the international legal system. And without international legal system, the world will not be able to deal with global warming and other issues of global dimension. So it's very important to educate people of the connections between what you've rightly asked and their own future and politics.
Thank you. Is there another question here in the audience? 1 second.
One is more comment that you may comment about. You mentioned Holocaust, and I think you wanted to say, how can Zionists do the same to Palestinians as was done in the Holocaust? And this is for the public. It is not known here very much is that the Nazis, the Zionists used to co-work with the Nazis, and they have killed on the 800,000 Hungarian Jews that were deported to Auschwitz. And I once found a book on the internet where I thought it could be the basis for Hitler's Mein Kampf. Would you know about this book? And I just started reading the book by Chada Karmi this morning, and she sides, Benny Morris, saying that there will never be an Israel unless the Palestinians are eliminated, in short said. What is your thought about this?
As general as someone whose family, many of members of my family were killed by the Nazis, I'm very careful with calling anyone a Nazi. I don't like it when it's referred to anyone. So I think it's bad enough. It's bad enough to say that what the Zionists are doing in Palestine is very much like what other settler colonial movements did in North America, in Australia, in South Africa. European settlers genocided native indigenous people. And I think that's the most important part of it. You're right historically that for a while some Zionist leaders collaborated with the Nazis because anti-Semitism doesn't want to see the Jews in Europe, neither does the Zionist movement. So I think that's the context. But it's not, I don't think that's the major issue. The major issue here is that a very clear ideology of a European settler movement that began in the late 19th century, that believes, like all settler colonial movements, in the elimination of the native. And elimination can be genocide, can be ethnic cleansing, can be apartheid, or all of them together. That this kind of policy that is still going on the 21st century and is still allowed to continue is the main problem here. So I think this is the main issue. And of course, the new thing that Rada Karmi has rightly pointed out to is that the new Israeli political elite, the one that controls Israel in the last, I would say, 20 years, is much more talking openly about the elimination, about the ethnic cleansing, about the removal of the Palestinians. Whereas the older Zionist elite, which had done the same, was very careful not to talk about it and to deny it. So we are facing a far worse version of Zionism in terms of its language, also in terms of its action, but it also should make it easier for us to enlarge the number of people who would understand as we do what is the danger of Zionism. What is the danger of this ideology, not only for Palestinians, but also for Jews and for many other people in the world? And I think that we should focus on explaining exactly what the ideology is, what the practices are, and insist on a solution that makes sure that these ideologies and these practices do not exist anymore. I think looking into the future, we should change some of the basic assumptions on which the so-called peace process was built until today. One assumption is that the Palestinians are not the ones who are leading the conversation about the future. This has to change. The Palestinians have to be the dominant voice in telling us how they like to see the future, and everyone else has to go along with this conversation. I'm not saying that there shouldn't be a dialogue. I'm not saying that this cannot be challenged or criticized, but this has to come from the Palestinians. Unfortunately, I don't think right now the Palestinian National Movement is in a position from an organizational point of view, from a political point of view, to present such a program. But I do hope this will happen soon. So I think that's one thing towards the future that we should change from the past, that the Palestinians are the driver of the car that leads us to the future. Not the Americans, not the Israelis, but the Palestinians themselves. This has never happened in the so-called peace process until today. But secondly, I think it's important to understand in history that sometimes processes that have nothing to do with each other can come together in a certain historical moment and create really a huge dramatic change. And this is, I think, what's happening now. So some of the things we can do, but some of the things are even beyond our power, but are happening. For example, as I mentioned it before, I think the whole political system that the colonial powers have built in the Eastern Mediterranean is collapsing. There is a kind of a civil war inside Israel between religious and secular Jews. All this is leading not to peace, but it's leading to a historical moment where one can hope to change dramatically the reality that is there today.